Good afternoon and welcome. We're so glad to have you joining us today, both in person and remotely from wherever you may be in the world. I'm Roland Greene, Director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to our spring celebration titled Hope, the Future of an Idea. This annual event is when we throw open our doors, not only for our usual exchange of ideas, but to show off the work of our fellows and to try to dissolve the barrier between speakers and audience. Last year's celebration was held under the same title, and we're experimenting with 2 or 3 year cycles in which cohorts of fellows would address the same topic as the world changes around us. And heaven knows, hope may mean even more today than it did a year ago. Yes. 4 of this year's fellows will talk about their work briefly to get us started, and then we will hold a general conversation in which everyone is welcome to join, and this includes the rest of the fellows, many of whom are present, as well as friends, supporters, former fellows, alumni, and the public. I know that there are a number of former fellows with us, both in person and virtually. Let me call out 2 of them in particular. Hershini Young, visiting from the University of Texas at Austin, was a faculty fellow last year and spoke at this event, the first HOPE event that we had a year ago. Another former fellow, the Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences, Deborah Satz. Both of you and all the rest, welcome back. In addition to those of you here in Leventhal Hall, of course, our embrace extends to our remote audience. But whoever you may be, past or current fellow, future fellow, member of the Stanford community, alumnus, supporter, you should feel warmly included at all of our occasions, not only this one, but our many other lectures and public events. For those of you who may be new to the Stanford Humanities Center, let me say just a few quick words of introduction. We are unusual among university-based humanities centers in that many of our peer institutions elsewhere concentrate on one thing. Some of them concentrate on public events like this one, some of them sponsoring research workshops for faculty and graduate students at that institution. Some of them specialize in offering research fellowships to their own faculty. We do all of these things, and we try to knit them together in a way that adds value to all of these activities. So we house a large number of resident fellows who are here with us for the year. This year we have had nearly 50 of them together at every level, from external faculty down to undergraduates. And we present a full calendar of events like this one. We hope that our fellows find their work enlivened by the visiting speakers. And while the visitors encounter an audience that includes not only Stanford scholars, but many others who have met for the year at this intellectual crossroads. Our online presence is the largest of any humanities center in the world, with about 60,000 visitors attending our events virtually in each of the last 2 years. One important part of our virtual home is Arcade, our digital salon, which may be found from the SHC homepage. Subtitled The Humanities in the World, Arcade is where we publish new work in a variety of settings, from informal to peer-reviewed. One of Arcade's features in particular, called Colloquies, gathers recent work on emerging topics and invites readers to comment, share, remix, and perhaps to contribute something themselves. For last year's event on Hope, we opened a colloquy with the title, Hope, the Future of an Idea, and invited our fellows to contribute their reflections. The colloquy is published on the Arcade homepage, and at the moment it contains about 20 contributions from fellows of both years, with many more to come. Everyone is invited to comment, perhaps share a favorite item on social media, perhaps write or record their own reflection on Hope and submit it to us. There's a big button on the homepage of the colloquy that says, submit to this colloquy. There's even a playlist on Spotify. Many ways to engage with the topic. Why Hope? When we were considering topics for last year's celebration, we landed on hope as a topic that many of our fellows, we thought for many of them would connect the intellectual and the personal, that evokes an ideal on the one hand, the imagining of a world to be, but also calls out for critical analysis. Hope for what? For whom? Who in this troubled world can afford hope? Who has the privilege of hoping? And who cannot? And finally, we thought hope speaks to the highest purposes of the humanities, which always invite us to reflect on the human-made world of ideas, values, and experiences within which both hope and hopelessness reside. If the humanities do not always inspire hope, they help us to understand where the urge to hope comes from, how thinkers have treated hope in the past, and how we might entertain such an ideal, not credulously, but in a critical spirit. Today, we'll hear from current SHC fellows about the role of hope in their research, how it figures in their work, or perhaps cuts against their work, and what it means to them both intellectually and personally. Before we begin, I'd like to mention to our Zoom audience that real-time captioning is available. You may click on the closed caption icon at the bottom where it says CC to start or stop viewing the captioning. The up arrow adjacent to that icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. After the brief presentations by our 4 fellows, we'll proceed with a panel discussion for about 20 minutes before inviting everyone else to join in the conversation with their own observations. And as always in our hybrid events, we encourage questions from both audiences, both in person and virtual. Members of the virtual audience who would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. And we always do our best to include your questions in the conversation. I'd also like to mention that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available in the coming days. Now, very briefly, let me introduce our presenters in the order that they'll be speaking. Chepchirchir Tirop is a historian of Kenya, East Africa, and the Indian Ocean world. She is with us this year as a dissertation prize fellow, one of the most competitive opportunities for 6th-year PhD students at Stanford. Current work, actually her dissertation project, explores the role of athletics in nation building in Kenya. I also can't resist mentioning that if we had held this event yesterday, you would be hearing from 3 PhDs, but today you're hearing from 4 because Chepchirchir defended her dissertation this afternoon. Ali Madani, Mellon postdoctoral fellow, PhD from Brown University, is a literary and cultural historian of early modern England. His research and teaching examine Shakespeare and Renaissance poetics, pre-modern race, and histories of criticism and modern discipline formation. Internal faculty fellow Indra Levy is associate professor of East Asian languages and cultures here at Stanford and a warmly cherished colleague of mine for many years. She works on modern Japanese literature with a particular interest in the changes that took place in conceptions of language, style, gender, and genre in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And last from left to right, but quite an important person for us this year, one of the most connective figures we've had among our community this year, it'd be hard to say goodbye to you, is external faculty fellow Marr Bruce, associate professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. Much of Lamar's scholarship explores and activates Black, queer, and mad expressive cultures spanning literature, music, film, theater, and the art and aesthetics of everyday life. His debut book, How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind, Madness and Black Radical Creativity, earned the Modern Language Association's 2022 First Book Prize. Without further ado, Chepchirchir, please start us off.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. As I reflected on what to share for this gathering, I kept returning to the moment I decided to write a history of Kenyan competitive running for my dissertation project. It was the spring of 2020 and California was on lockdown. Amidst news of travel restrictions, rising death toll, and constantly checking in with my family in Kenya, I sat to complete my pending assignments from the winter quarter. I was taking a course titled Women in African History, and Professor Joelle Cabrita had given us an option to write either a biography of an African woman, or for those who identified as African women, to write our autobiographies if we so desired. Throughout the quarter, I was vehemently opposed to writing about myself. I had written a number of personal statements for college applications, and those were more than enough. But when I found myself alone in my apartment, taking classes on Zoom and in dire need of some hope, the autobiography became an answered prayer. I wrote it to feel connected to my community, which at that moment felt more distant than ever. At a time of despair and uncertainty, I turned to my life history to comfort and ground my spirit in gratitude for all the blessings in my life. The autobiography became both an intellectual and reflective exercise, which highlighted for me individual and communal dreams that had helped get me to where I was. In doing this assignment, I noticed something that had previously been unremarkable to me: the fact that Kenyan competitive runners played a significant role in my educational journey. For my primary school education, I attended Kipkeino Primary School, a school founded by one of Kenya's first running legends, Chepchirchir Tirop, with financial support from the International Olympic Committee. Upon completing high school, I decided to apply to universities in the USA as the best chance for me to pursue a degree in the humanities. I had been admitted to medical school in Kenya, and no matter how hard I tried, I could not see myself as a doctor. A program called KENSA, then the Kenya Scholar Athlete Project, and now the Kenya Scholar Access Program, provided financial and advising support, which helped me apply successfully to Amherst College. And this program was founded by another former Kenyan Olympian and American collegiate runner, Mike Boyd, and his friend, American journalist, John Manners. After submitting that assignment, I remained interested in these runners and their experiences. They were by no means part of the political elite or necessarily wealthy, but using the social and financial capital they earned through their running talent, they built worlds that have benefited thousands of individuals and communities, including me. As a historian of Kenya, interested in questions of nation, identity, and belonging, I wondered what it would mean to refract the history of the nation through the experiences of these runners. Hence, out of a deep desire for a glimmer of hope during a bleak time, my dissertation project was born. And this is the project I've been working on over the past 3 or so years and concluded today. As part of my research, I have read memoirs of and by Kenyan runners, listened to their stories over cups of sweet, milky Kenyan tea, and gleaned their stories from different archives and media sources. The lived experiences of these ordinary Kenyan men and women have continued to be a source of hope and inspiration. A common thread in my research shows how Kenyan runners have constantly challenged state narratives that try to reduce the meaning of their running talent and success towards narrow nationalistic goals. Instead, they have used their running success to improve their socioeconomic lives and those of their communities, to create meaningful transnational networks between Kenya and other countries, and for sheer pleasure and enjoyment. Looking at the state of our world, where narratives of grandeur and progress are increasingly premised on military prowess, exclusionary nationalist politics and policies, and technological advancement at the expense of our environment, I have found myself thinking about how the history of Kenyan running can offer alternative ways to imagine and narrate ambition, greatness, and success in more humane ways. I have come to see running as a thing that invites us in an embodied and effective way into a more harmonious relationship with our individual selves, the local, national, and international communities of which we are part, and the environment we inhabit. Indeed, Kenyan runners themselves think of what they do as more than just competitive sports. They often see themselves as world makers beyond the stadiums, running tracks, and roads. Over the years, they have given Kenyan running a distinctive character. one where success on the track is legitimized by doing good in one's community, whether through building schools, promoting peace initiatives in conflict-prone areas, or using one's winning to support less well-off family members. And this is where I see hope in my work, and how these runners stay connected and committed to one's local community while still participating and inspiring a larger global community. It is not a perfect project, and its actors are not romantic heroes, but it is hopeful for a better world. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Roland for inviting me to speak today and for the Humanities Center staff for organizing this event. I'm especially grateful to Sophia Van Dyke for, among innumerable else, taking care of our 2-year-old daughter, Tala, so I can be up here. The book project that I've been working on during my time at Stanford attempts to reconsider the history of fictionality as it intersects with histories of discipline formation and histories of empire, how colonial contact changes our concept of what counts as fiction. So in that vein, let's take the long view. To study Shakespeare's works and literature of the English Renaissance, as I do, is to look back from these texts' vantage point to those of antiquity, to trace the way Renaissance writers reworked and remixed literary forms, philosophies, and values from ancient Greece and Rome in the context of Protestant Christianity, expanding trade and exploration, and a nascent empire. Yet to study this period's literature and culture asks also that we look forward to the modern, and to the ways these monumental works of the English language anticipate, influence, and serve novel purposes in and for a more secular culture and advancing empire. In this broader view of history, stretching some 2 millennia back and more than 4 centuries forward, we reckon with a hope at vastly different scales that offers us, at turns, both consolation and utter despair. From this extended perspective, we see hope's radical fluctuations responding to devastating plague, the horrors of world wars and colonization, and the many triumphs of the human spirit. Throughout, one quality remains consistent: the power of narrative to shape and reshape experience, to offer consolation, to supply some hope at scale. It's okay, Tala. King Lear, perhaps Shakespeare's greatest tragedy, traces a curious path through time. The drama, like all durable works of literature, arrives to us not merely from its moment of publication in 1608, rather this narration of the decline of the patriarch into senility as he, unburdened, crawls towards death, looks markedly different over the 4 centuries. Set in the 8th century BC, the play appears first in print as the true chronicle history of King Lear, then 15 years later as a tragedy, and then back to a genre history for the remainder of the century. It's at the close of the 17th century that Nahum Tate set to change more than the titular genre. He worked also to rewrite Lear's catastrophic 5th act, filled with despair, death, and utter hopelessness, so that audiences and readers would be left in a more bearable and happier state. Life replaces death, and love reunites families. Tate's version dominated the page and stage from the 1680s to the start of the 20th century. The tragedy of King Lear was too great a burden, but its narrative trajectory could be altered. Think of Shakespeare's The Tempest and its lead character, Prospero, an educated sorcerer and sometimes avatar for Shakespeare, deposed and exiled from his post as Duke of Milan to an island sparsely inhabited, an island conjured by the London Commercial Theatre as something of a mixture between the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. Upon arriving to the island with his daughter Miranda, Prospero frees the trapped spirit Ariel, trading his physical freedom for indentured servitude. Caliban, the only other human form at the start of the play, preceded Prospero, having arrived via his Algerian sorcerer mother Sycorax sometime before. Prospero enslaves Caliban, and Caliban in turn gives poetic voice to the pains of the colonized and enslaved subjects whose numbers increased exponentially after the play's publication in 1623. Prospero's name gives us a version of hope. From the Latin spero, meaning hope, we derive a sense of expectation and abundance, to prosper. Yet it is Caliban's rebellious defiance and deep eloquence on the plight of the enslaved and colonized that granted prosperous hope to so many in the decolonial period we continue to inhabit. Think Aimé Césaire's 1969 A Tempest, a rewriting of Shakespeare's drama from the perspective of the world's Calibans. His story has served to inspire those stripped by various European empires of their language, culture, religion, freedom, and family to assert their human dignity and reject a narrative of righteous subjugation. Narrative change is not material change. It neither liberates the enslaved nor feeds the starving. Nor still are these two essential modes divorced from one another. To alter the material conditions requires an altered sense of possibility, a narrative of hope, however limited. One German-born philosopher of history repeated and modified his predecessor in observing that all great persons and facts in history occurred twice, first as tragedy and then as farce. The subjects of this commentary were Emperor Napoleon, whom the elder philosopher Hegel witnessed arrive in the city of Vienna with world historical force, giving way to his nephew, the inept bourgeois King Napoleon, whom Marx, the younger philosopher, derided for his essential tackiness. The exalted followed by the petite, the grand genre, then the common. If tragedy for these thinkers of the 18th and 19th centuries operated by means of a noble and fated necessity working towards ultimate catastrophe, farce leaned on mere accident, a bumbling from one act to the next. In our own era, we might try on this formula to see if we can find footing in the delirious experience of living through historical rupture. Working through the second Trump administration prompts me to reverse the sequence of history genres, as from where I stand, I see the stuff of tragedy replacing initial farce. The threat to universities, to the humanities, to my hopes for a stable career and home feel ever more tragically overwhelming, a Lear-like catastrophe without comfort. I've taken some license in remixing the historical formula. After all, reworking the narrative is a mechanism of hope, even and especially when hope feels depleted. I'm enough of a historian to hold deep skepticism of the seduction of grand narratives, and yet I'm also a literary theorist, clinging tightly to my belief in narrative as strategy. Stanford's own Francis Fukuyama prematurely announced the end of history at the close of the Cold War to declare the victory of Western ideology over communist forms. All followed the lead instead of Sun Ra, the great Afrofuturist pioneer and prophet from Saturn, when he chidingly reminded audiences in the 1970s, "It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet?" History, tragedy, farce, catastrophe, comedy, given enough time and resources, will make new narratives of hope when all seems lost, after the end of the world. May that be some consolation, or a useful strategy at least. Thanks.
That was just a little reenactment of what I've been doing for weeks since I agreed to speak today. Knowing that the topic was hope, I thought, well, maybe I better find some before I open my mouth and talk about it. And I struggled with this for as I said, for weeks. And I finally came to the conclusion that maybe hope is most like a cat. It scurries out of sight as soon as you make a point of chasing after it. But if you're really lucky, it might saunter across your line of sight or even brush up against your ankles when you're thinking about something else. So I decided to think about something else for a little bit. My current research revolves around the rise of a new comic sensibility in late 19th and early 20th century Japan. I don't, as a matter of habit, actively chase after hope in my work, but when I think about it, I am constantly hoping for some kind of sudden illumination. And it turns out that sudden illumination is often the key ingredient in a lot of great humor. These days, I'm especially interested in jokes that suddenly impede narrative momentum. Why? Widely shared narratives can pack a wallop of propulsive force. Once they have our attention, they carry us through a chain of causal relations. This happened because this happened, and that happened, and that happened, all leading up to a conclusion that often seems unavoidable. And our thinking processes are so dependent on narratives that we often fail to notice when we've become trapped inside them. Jokes can break this momentum. They can open up new vistas by forcing us to look sideways and up and down instead of just craning forward. Let me give you an example. In Japan during the early 20th century, newspaper journalists made it their business to promote narratives of national pride, stoking emotions that helped propel Japan into a war with Russia in 1904, and even leading to riots against the Japanese government when victory in that war failed to produce major concessions. If anti-government riots were the unintended consequence of excessive narrative momentum, another unintended consequence was the emergence of a new comic sensibility that included some searing jokes about national consciousness itself. One of these jokes would appear in the very newspapers several years after the war ended, in a serialized novel by Natsume Soseki. Ooh, hello. One of Japan's great writers. My son did that too when he was that age. Soseki's entire literary career could be called the unintended consequence of a Japanese government scholarship that sent him to England to study literature. The idea was to produce a Japanese scholar who could teach English literature at the university, thus eliminating the need to rely on foreign experts. Soseki did teach at Tokyo University, Imperial University at the time, for a few years, but he ended up quitting his professorship to become a full-time novelist instead. In 1908, he published Sanshiro, a novel named after a young protagonist who travels from Kumamoto, a provincial city, to attend Tokyo Imperial University. In the train on the way to Tokyo, an older man happens to strike up a conversation with him. Their exchange begins with the older man admiring a Western couple passing by the window. Now let me read from the novel. The older man is the one who begins speaking. Oh, and look at that. The cat showing up. All right. We Japanese are sad-looking things next to them. We can beat the Russians, we can become a first-class power, but it doesn't make any difference. We still have the same faces, the same feeble little bodies. Just look at the houses we live in, the gardens we build around them. They're just what you'd expect from faces like this. Oh yes, this is your first trip to Tokyo, isn't it? You've never seen Mount Fuji. We go by it a little farther on. Have a look. It's the finest thing Japan has to offer, the only thing we have to boast about. The trouble is, of course, it's just a natural object. It's been sitting there for all time. We didn't make it. He grinned broadly once again. Sanshiro had never expected to meet anyone like this after Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War. The man was almost not Japanese, he felt. But still, Sanshiro argued, Japan will start developing from now on at least. Japan is going to perish, the man replied coolly. Anyone who dared to say such a thing in Kumamoto would have been beaten on the spot and perhaps even arrested for treason. Sanshiro had grown up in an atmosphere that gave his mind no room at all for inserting an idea like this. Could the man be toying with him, taking advantage of his youth? The man was still grinning, but he spoke with complete detachment. Sanshiro did not know what to make of him. He decided to say nothing. But then the man said, Tokyo is bigger than Kumamoto, and Japan is bigger than Tokyo, and even bigger than Japan. He paused and looked at Sanshiro, who was listening intently now. Even bigger than Japan is the inside of your head. Don't ever surrender yourself, not to Japan, not to anything. You may think that what you're doing is for the sake of the nation, but let something take possession of you like that, and all you do is bring it down. This joke may not be the kind of thing that makes us laugh out loud, but I think that's because it teases us as much as it toys with Sanshiro. Just like him, we're expecting something else to be bigger than Japan, namely the West. And with a perfectly timed sidestep, the older man derails the familiar train of thinking that he had set in motion, planting a new seed in the young protagonist and in the reader. At a time when it is impossible to know what the future holds and how we will manage to navigate our way through it, I find glimmers of hope in the idea that unintended consequences happen all the time. They're not always bad, and whatever direction our narratives seem to be propelling us toward, there is still the possibility that they can be productively derailed. And last but not least, I want to say a heartfelt thanks to Roland and the staff of this Stanford Humanities Center for all that you do, for all that you have done to make this year possible for us. It has been a great privilege and a pleasure to be part of this year's amazing cohort. So thank you.
Afternoon, friends. What a precious pleasure to gather with you all. I'm going to dive right in. Our theme this afternoon, the banner we gather under today at the Humanities Center, is hope, the future of an idea. Alongside this, I want to raise up another banner. I want to articulate another theme that might also orient and galvanize our proceedings. Hope, a practice for the present. Hope, the future of an idea. Hope, a practice for the present. The crises of this conjuncture, the political and existential catastrophes that harm and terrorize many of us right now in May 2025, these demand that I emphasize the present alongside the future, that I stress practice alongside ideas. I want to make clear I don't intend to supplant hope, the future of an idea. I want to supplement, to offer a crucial supplement with hope, a practice for the present. This emphasis on practice orients my broader work as humanities scholar and practitioner. My research and teaching center the life worlds of Black, queer, mad, captive, and other people who make art and culture under extreme duress. I write and teach ideas to support, articulate, inspire, honor, plan, and rally practices of liberation and practices of social transformation. I generate and disseminate scholarship to support material outcomes, scholarship that might participate, if only modestly, if inconspicuously, in bettering this world, these worlds where we live. I'm now writing a book about Black love. One of the ways that I think of love, that I feel love, that I do love, is as a radical and practiced commitment to the well-being of the beloved, right? To its flourishing, protection, wholeness, goodness, and fulfillment. A radical and practiced commitment to the well-being of the beloved. Regarding hope, consider this: so-called liberal democracies encourage their subjects to cultivate hope, to believe that good will prevail, to place faith in prevailing institutions and structures, to trust that things will get better in a teleological parade marching toward progress. Considering the despotic, demonic regime infesting the White House today and its legions and minions swarming and creeping around this world, the project of hope feels especially fraught for many. But I hasten to highlight that for some of us, Trump's evil does not feel especially novel. What distinguishes his regime might be its flagrancy, its spectacularity, its intensity, but not its fundamental substance. For you see, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, settler colonial rancor, warmongering, anti-Semitism, genocide, catastrophic capitalism, and fascism have all been certified and celebrated by presidential decrees long before January 20th, 2017, when Trump first took office. Some people have endured perpetual precarity and constant injury: Black, queer, mad, trans, captive, poor, indigenous people, among others. Some people have experienced harm as an inalienable fact of American life, not the inalienable rights enshrined in 1776, but inalienable harm. For such persons, hope may feel tenuous, vexed, tortured, untenable, laughable, lamentable, impossible, now as before. Or, to the contrary, maybe those who endure centuries long onslaughts of violence and terror, maybe they build up the mightiest store of hope, the most durable kind of hope, hope that is burnished in the cruel crucible of degradation. For Black people in the US nation state since the transatlantic slave trade, hope is often the presumed paradigmatic principle for political will and rights claims, right? That hope has often been attached to leaders, processes, and institutions. Hope in Abraham Lincoln, hope in emancipation, hope in the 13th Amendment, hope in Reconstruction, hope in the benevolence of, quote, good white folks, unquote, hope in victory abroad and victory at home, hope in Lyndon B. Johnson, hope in civil rights legislation, hope in Barack Obama, hope in body cams, hope in the checks and balances of the courts. No wonder it's been a focal point in Black political and social philosophy. I've surveyed the wisdom of a range of prominent Black cultural workers in thinking on hope, from David Walker to Frederick Douglass, Fannie Lou Hamer, Martin Luther King Jr., Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, Nina Simone, Malcolm X, Toni Morrison, Assata Shakur, Frank Wilderson, Kendrick Lamar, among others. I won't spend time cataloging their positions, which range from regarding hope as sacrosanct and utterly unimpeachable and indispensable, to expressing restlessness with hope as a structure of feeling, to rejecting it as a ruse altogether, to admitting deep ambivalence about it. Ambivalence is my posture and my method. I know that hope can constitute a mode of radical imagination that helps us see the world we want to build. I'm not denying that material progress has occurred, that some of the hope-laden people and projects I just listed and institutions have contributed to our ongoing liberation projects, but I also know that hope can be a tool of hegemony to distract or dissuade us from actualizing our freedom dreams. Too often, an acquiescent hope, an acquiescent quote unquote hope, becomes a ruse to keep our gaze fixed on some distant horizon while forfeiting the worlds where we reside. Too often, hegemonic hope, quote unquote hope, keeps us hypnotized by the prospect of a far off cool breeze to distract us from the fire burning at our feet, the smoke choking our lungs. Refusing this hegemonic hope, I'm invested in a radical, critical, ethical, instrumental practice of hope, a practice that entails planning, dreaming, gathering, organizing, demanding, planting, sowing, stockpiling, agitating, rebelling, building, dismantling, abolishing, dancing, loving, to usher in the world we hope to see, even if it doesn't arrive in time for us to see it in person. So thus far, I've pondered hope as an idea and practice, and now I close with a meditation on hope as feeling, among other feelings. I am foremost a scholar of feelings. So hope is idea, hope is practice. Let's think about hope as feeling. I arrived at Stanford intending in August of 2024, intending to draft the aforementioned book about Black love. It's called Come Outside, Black Love in a Wide Open Place. And the book is a study and act of Black love outside, both physical and metaphysical outsides. I arrived at Stanford also professing, and many of the fellows may remember this, I arrived at Stanford professing a commitment to conviviality, to joyful camaraderie, as scholarly method and way of life that I would practice here. So simply put, I led with and lead with love and joy, perhaps the most exemplary good feelings. I want to emphasize, though, that love and joy are also ideas and practices. But for now, let's emphasize how they are regarded and experienced as feelings. So yes, I arrived leading with love and joy, the most exemplary of good feelings. Hope is another exemplary good feeling, and it also might be the most valorized of political affects. Even more than love and joy, which are sometimes regarded as too sentimental, too personal, too self-indulgent to orient political spheres, hope is typically touted as the most noble and dutiful helpmeet to liberal progress. I want to propose that, in tandem with hope, convergent with hope, we must honor and even cultivate negative affects, bad feelings too. I contend that fear, outrage, disgust, guilt, wariness, and animosity are critical for confronting these times. Fear, outrage, disgust, guilt, wariness, and animosity. Let's briefly consider each. Fear, fear might paralyze some, but it activates me to fight. And I'm fine being afraid as long as I'm brave. Burning outrage might cause some people to burn up or burn out, but it fuels me. Disgust might turn some stomachs, but it propels my feet in order to face and fight what disgusts me. Guilt might be a narcissistic exercise in self-flagellation for some, but when I'm displeased with my own failings, I feel a deep urge to do better. Animosity might corrode the hearts of some, but engaging what I despise helps me clarify by contrast what I love. Listen, I despise that fucker in the White House and his minions. And that animus animates, invigorates, electrifies some of my political will. To be clear, love is a far more frequent basis for my politics than animus, but animus has some efficacy too. Argue with me if you'd like. Weariness for some might be a prelude to laying down and giving up. But weariness might also be a signal to lay down and rest so that we can get back up revived. And you know what? Hope, I believe, is sharpened and refined and strengthened when it rubs up against these bad feelings. So I'll end here with this proclamation and reminder. If we want the idea of hope to have a future, then we must insist on and undertake the practice of hope right now. Thank you.
You've heard from, is it on? You've heard from 4 of this year's fellows. There are about 45 others that could have spoken this year alone, and we had another 50 last year. We'll have 50 more next year, and we've been doing this for 45 years. This is a unique place, and I think you can get from this event, you can get just a little sample of what we do here every year and how the fellows not only pursue their own projects, but interact with each other, sharpen each other's ideas, critique each other constantly, which is the heart of what we do here in our fellowship program. I'm eager to get to the general conversation that includes all of you. So I'm just going to ask our 4 speakers a couple of questions to try to bring them together a little bit around these presentations. First question is this. I noticed that, so we heard from first a historian, second a literary scholar who deals with the deep past, then a literary scholar who deals with the more recent period, but nonetheless the past, and in the context of a particular national frame in Japan. And then finally, a truly interdisciplinary scholar, originally trained in American studies, but now really a kind of cultural historian of affect and many other things. They're very different in some senses disciplinarily. And I noticed that the 2 literary scholars, the 2 sitting in the middle, both relied on the term narrative to talk about hope. That for both of them, hope is in some sense a story we tell, or a kind of or perhaps hopelessness is also a story we tell ourselves, but that both of them framed the whole question of hope as a matter of narrative or story. So I want to throw this out to all 4. In what sense, in your training, perhaps in your current work, is it useful to think of hope as, in some sense, a story?
Yeah, we can start. Okay, I'll think of it.
Thank you. Since the 4 of us learned that we were asked to speak here today, we have caught each other's eyes at the lunch table or in the hallway, and have just been asking each other, "What are you doing? How will you respond to this prompt now?" And I think those brief conversations and acknowledgments of the difficulty have been, really helpful for us to think through some of our ideas together. And I think I'd add you as well to the list of narrative focuses. Yours partly, involves your own narrative. But I think, at least for me, that's the surest way I know how to deal with the desire for hope is the shift straight into narrative, and that is my training as a literary scholar. But to me, it feels like hope is so dependent on cultivating a future that you can embrace with some kind of love, or to frame it as a desire. And it does feel very much like a practice as well. And it felt very important for me to acknowledge that hope is a narrative, but narrative is not materiality, not material change. And yet you can't really have one without the other. They're unsustainable. And if you can start with the narrative, hopefully the material change comes along as well.
Narratives are frequently instructions on how to live, right? So the dominant narrative. Oh. Can you hear? Hello? Okay. I think frequently about how narratives are instructions for living in many contexts, right? The Constitution is a narrative, right? The bylaws that govern institutions of higher learning, those are narratives. Yeah, the Communist Manifesto is a narrative, right? Assata Shakur's autobiography is a narrative, and all of these sort of narrative projects have tremendous power to instruct, to orient, to propel, to embolden, to inhibit, to terrify, to terrorize the sort of life worlds of the people who read and internalize them. So my training is actually much of my training at the graduate student level was in literary studies, but I always already, like Ali, am thinking about the ways in which the narratives on the page sort of leap out into worlds. And I refuse sort of drawing a hard and fine line between narrative and practice. Sometimes narrative is practice, it does practice, it inspires practice, it compels practice. And sometimes practices, right, are only sort of legible by way of the narratives that emerge from them.
I guess I would just say I don't know whether it's because I was attracted to literature and chose to study it for profession, or I'm just oriented towards language, or that I find it actually difficult to think without narratives. And the more I sort of pondered that fact and what's happening today, I have to say I agree. I don't think that we can necessarily separate narrative from reality. I think our reality and how we experience it is always shaped by narrative. And then what I started to think about was, when I'm thinking about this question of hope, whether we feel it or not, whether we see it or not, I wonder if that has something to do with what's at the basis. There's a foundation upon which we build narratives that's oftentimes invisible. And I feel like the foundation for me, there are some invisible foundations that just have disappeared in the last 10 years. Like some things I totally took for granted, now I can't take them for granted anymore. And it makes it very difficult to think through, well, what kind of narrative do I have now? And what narrative did I have before that doesn't work anymore? I just feel like things are out of whack. And so that's where I'm at. I do think through narratives. I'd love to hear from somebody who doesn't, because I can't even imagine what that's like. Yeah.
I would say I would absolutely echo you, Indra. So I'm a historian who loves reading a lot of novels and hangs out with anthropologists because I just think they're so cool. And I think, shout out Kelda. But all this to say, I think historians also tell stories all the time. That's what we're always looking for. And often the case, even in my own project, is trying to see how all these stories relate to each other, where are the clashes, where do people negotiate and balance, the sort of narratives that are on the table. And to connect to the comment about practice, running is absolutely a practice. You can't, well, maybe you could imagine yourself running, but for a lot of the runners with whom I talk, and they did have some time in a training camp running, and it was not easy, right? So it's like balancing or coupling a narrative you tell yourself about your past, your current present as your training and your future goals. So I think it combines both of those, sort of the two sides we've been talking about of narrative and practice.
And may I just add very briefly, I listed a number of, I listed, manifesto, constitution, autobiography. I also want to emphasize the narratives that are spun at kitchen tables, right? When your grandmama sits down with you to tell you about her day or to recount for you her time marching with the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, right? I think it's really important for us to sort of honor the sort of informal, sometimes subterranean, unrecognized or underengaged spaces in which critical narratives are produced and circulated, right? Outside of the academy, right? Street corners, prison yards, kitchen tables, bedrooms, playgrounds are all spaces where narrative is being spun that changes, that impacts the world on various registers. So I want to be clear. We're not just talking, or I'm not just talking, none of us are just talking manifestos and constitutions here.
Great, thank you. One more question for the four of them before I turn it over to the rest of you. I'm inspired by the fact that Marr is, as I said, in part a kind of historian of affect or of feeling. So I want to ask a question about affect or feeling. You come here, so each of you you're in your respective disciplines or interdisciplines, as the case may be. You come here with a project to work at the Stanford Humanities Center. It's, I don't have to tell most people that it can be uncommon for a historian to spend a full year at close quarters with anthropologists and philosophers and musicologists. We cultivate an unusual opportunity here for people to sharpen their work against the edges of others in other disciplines whom they might encounter perhaps professionally, but not necessarily intellectually in the day-to-day work of an American university. I want to ask you what this past year has been like for you in terms of the affect of intellectual work, because intellectual work it can involve not only, of course, ideas that we hope are good ideas and rigorous and well developed by the end of your time here, but also sensations of surprise, wonder, admiration for what somebody else does, just sheer awe. Like, I didn't know people did that, or I didn't realize that anybody could work on something like that, or I didn't realize that such and such concept had a history. So I want to ask each of you briefly to say something about the affective dimension of your intellectual work over this past year.
I think I can go first. I think for me, the most beautiful thing is I've been feeling so energized by everyone's conversation. I think it's so often when we are working on our all individual projects, and then you're deep in writing or you're deep in looking at archives, sometimes you can feel like you're being like channeled into one little corner. But then when we go to lunch, when we attend each other's talks, every time I come out having connected my thoughts to everyone else's, and sometimes not, but I think it does something to my brain that makes it look like makes my brain feel excited to go back to my work. So the idea of being energized is really important to me, especially in a career where you can feel so exhausted and where you never really leave your work in the office. It always walks with you. I randomly think about Kenyan running while taking a shower or something like that, right? So to think about these moments where you feel rejuvenated in your work. And so those are like the two feelings I would put on the table.
I agree, and the first thought that came to me was inspired by the diversity of the work that's done here and the scope and breadth of the work that's done here. But also, I think my dominant emotion, my dominant affect is comfort. I get to be a part of a cohort, the Mellon Fellows. All of these people are in the same stage of their career as I am, which means that we've completed our degrees, and we are writing our first books. And we're also seeking permanent positions. We're seeking tenure track jobs, and it's always been a tough trajectory in the humanities, or at least it has been for the last 25 years or so. And yet at the moment it's even more difficult, and we're in the strange, somewhat lonely position of being delighted to be given such an opportunity to be here at Stanford, at the same time in need of comfort, because what happens next is still very unclear. And I think that kind of community has been really valuable to me, to be among fellows who are both rewarded and a little afraid, and that community is really important.
So I would say a couple of the most inspiring things that have happened to me over this year was this cohort is extremely creative, and the staff are also very creative. And there's just a lot of creative energy on top of the intellectual energy, and just being able to reconnect with that was really a delight. And on top of that, I think one of the advantages of being in a place where there's so many different disciplines is that you need to communicate with each other. When we give these research talks, I think everybody makes an effort to communicate beyond the boundaries of their discipline. And that can be very freeing, and it can combine that with the creative energy. This is going to sound very simple, but it really came home to me this year. It can allow you to find your own voice, to find a way to communicate with people that's not dominated by the kind of one's own image of the disciplinary discourse. And that's been really a delight. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of the cohort for that.
So I mentioned conviviality, right, which is about living joyfully with. And I'm tremendously grateful for the conviviality that we have collectively forged during our lunchtime meetings. Just the sheer sort of goodwill and kindness that I've encountered and been able to cultivate. A counterpoint, though, to conviviality is commiseration for me, right? And misery, right, is the root of commiseration. It's about sort of sharing sorrow and finding comfort in collectively articulating sorrow. And amid what's happening in the world, I'm especially grateful for not just living joyfully with, but living sorrowfully with my colleagues, right? This shit's been awful. It has, it is enough to drive one crazy. It is enough to sort of bring down one's spirit. It is enough to have one fundamentally question one's trajectory. Mm-hmm. And when I'm describing isn't merely one presidential regime. I want to be clear that what I understand myself to be up against precedes and exceeds Donald Trump, right? So thank you for conviviality and for commiseration.
Okay. Now let's open the conversation to everyone else. And we welcome your, Kelda has a microphone. We welcome your questions and comments. We have one here in the front row.
Thank you. I'm particularly interested in the view of the third fellow because I recently had discovered that since the late 19th century, Japan has started the militarism and against China, basically very similar to Nazi towards the Jewish people. They viewed the Chinese as subhumans. And there are also many literature at that time, maybe there can be viewed as propaganda today, basically they have a hope. The hope is that the Japan is going to be the dominant force in the world. And then I have found out that Japan has really murdered 50 million Chinese, okay, during the Second World War. Different from Germany, that Japan did not have a like denazification effort in Germany. So there's still many top government officials going to the Temple of the National Honor, which many of the criminals are still there. So I just wondered, there are two kinds of hope. They have their national hope, that kind, to be the top country, top people in the world. But I wondered whether, since you study the literatures of the 20th century, whether there is a hope more like Obama's audacity of hope. Do they have a hope that they want to sort of repent for this crime they have put on? It's a huge crime. We're talking about 5 million people killed, Jewish people killed. We're talking about 50 million Chinese, 10 times as many. So just wonder whether there's any of the.
I think I understand your question, and I would just say in response, I studied literature, and one of the reasons why I was so interested in the example that I read today was I think that I think it's important for us to make a distinction between people and the behavior of the state, behavior of people, and the behavior of people in different eras. And I think there's a big difference between the way that Japanese people were behaving in the late 19th century, the way that they behave today, just as there's a big difference between how Americans were behaving even 20 years ago and how they're behaving today, and the way that to not mix those two things up. I'm not, when I talk about hope, I'm not talking in the same way as the way that you invoke the term as an aspiration to be the best. I think that's really a different kind of thing. That's maybe an aspiration or ambition and not a hope. So I don't know if that helps you, but I that's a kind of question that I can't quite answer in the same way that I've been thinking about this issue of hope. How would I define hope? That's the big question, right? And that was why I was sort of I don't have a definition for it, and in some ways, I guess I ask myself, I'm not hopeless, right? I wake up every day, but that's partly because I have this narrative in mind of the sun is going to rise tomorrow. Well, maybe it won't. I don't know, but that's the narrative I tell myself for sure. I'm not hopeless, but it's not something that I focus on all the time, I guess. And so that's what I meant in saying that if you think about other things, it kind of could sneak up on you. But I feel like, for me anyway, trying to find it head on is close to impossible. I found it very difficult to do. Yeah.
I had a feeling Eli was going to have a question, and I'm glad I was right.
Were you hopeful that I would have a question? Thank you all. As always, this is inspirational. So many things that I thought about, and I hoped as I was listening to my colleagues here. I wouldn't describe myself as a hopeful person in general about anything. I'm not an optimist. I always think of the worst case scenario, etc. And particularly your talk, Lamar, was about hope being a transformative force for today, praxis, as you described. In your research, have you seen narratives, contexts, time periods where lack of hope itself was transformative.
Yes. I write about King Lear, and I've also recently taught it for the first time in many years. And wow, is that a depressing play? It begins with a kind of tragic misunderstanding between Lear and his daughters, in which his favored daughter miscalculates in expressing her love to him, and her answer is infuriating to her father, and she's pushed out, she's disinherited, and it only gets worse from there. It does end in a generically tragic way. A pile of bodies, a great deal of sadness. And there's this kind of extremely touching moment that is overwhelming for most readers, at least it was until the 20th century, where they've acted too slowly, and the favored daughter, has been hanged. And Lear comes on stage carrying her body. And he's gone mad, he's gone senile, but he thinks maybe she's still breathing. Maybe. He asks for a mirror to hold up to her mouth to see if there's breath on the mirror. And those are his last words. His last kind of moment is thinking, oh, look, there, I see. And then he's dead. And that lack of hope in an entire play, a very long play, which only gets worse, has this kind of minor moment, kind of tiny little moment of something in that hopelessness. It's not much, but there's something to go out on that note for King Lear to part on, in kind of a half recognition that maybe something's there. I like that.
Maybe I can attempt. I was just thinking, I was like, wow, I don't, because I'm a very hopeful person, sometimes to a fault. I sometimes impose that on my historical actors and read them romantically, and I often have to check myself in that way. But one example I can think of is of a particular memoir of an athlete, a Kenyan athlete, that was very inspirational for me for various reasons. He was a world record holder. He went to WSU, Washington State Uni, broke 4 records in 4 different events in 81 days. That's madness, actually. It's just really exemplary. But then he gets very much, what is the word, exploited by all kinds of actors, shoe sponsors, his coaches, the Kenyan bureaucracy. And he also struggles with alcoholism. And so all his efforts are just like sort of drained down, and he finds himself homeless in the US, sometimes ending up in prison. And so it was a story that it's funny because I keep comparing like sort of narratives. And so in a lot of media, it's considered like a lost hope story. But then he managed to write his own memoir because he never really went to school. He was brought to the US to sort of run and never really got an education in that way. But then he went back to school after rehabilitation and everything and decided to pen his own memoir to tell his own story. And he sort of reclaimed his Olympic story, or rather his running story, and said, that was not really my dream. Was kind of reframing it and said, my real dream was to be able to get an education and to write my own story. And so that the fact that I've left behind this story is enough for me. And that Olympic running greatness is okay, but it's not. So I was just thinking about that idea of how in one, if you look at different like narratives, on one hand, it's just like a lost story, don't be like this one. But then in another space, if you find his other story, it kind of treats that. So that's the only example I can think of.
I can think of endless examples within the context of sort of Black political imagination, people withdrawing hope from particular entities like the US agency, like the framework of civil rights, right? At a certain point, MLK And sort of the two most prominently referenced, perhaps, leaders in sort of 1960s liberation movements, MLK and Malcolm X, both pivoted away from civil rights as the paradigm of right pursuit to human rights, to appealing to something beyond the nation state, right? So, the Black radical tradition and Black liberation pursuits have always been this stance around extending hope to certain entities and withdrawing it. And there's a movement within Black cultural studies today called Afro-pessimism that fundamentally withdraws hope from even the paradigm of the human, the notion of the human. The suggestion is that sort of modern notion of humanness is contingent fundamentally upon the degradation, the annihilation, the sort of ontological negation of Black people. So we shouldn't, as Black people, even be attempting to reconcile ourselves to humanness or human rights. We should abandon the human altogether, right? Which is a position I don't quite align with, but my point is that what you're describing, where hopelessness, or we don't have to call it a hopelessness necessarily, but an adamant refusal of or criticality about hope has been instrumental in Black living.
Hi, friends, and thank you, Nilay, for your questions, which are always so amazing. And I'm going to just build off of yours. So as you were answering this last question in particular, I was thinking about you've given us this wonderful sort of prism of hope, looking at it from different angles, idea, practice, feeling, the cat imagery, I love it. The sad, delusional, mad moment of regret at the end of the year. And Nilay, then you use the word optimism. So I just like each of you to think now, as you've thought about this, is hope optimism? I'm not sure I'm seeing them as synonyms, but are you? And where's the difference? How does it relate to optimism? You already started, Lamar, with your last one.
Just now when Lamar was talking about, the idea that you would draw your hope from one area and put it somewhere else, it made me think, well, maybe my approach has been wrong and it's not something that you go out and find. It's something that we all carry with us. And it's just, it becomes an investment. Where do you invest that hope? And right now it's really hard to see, right? Where do we put it? We have it, but as long, I kind of think you could say that as long as we're living and breathing, there's always some hope. I mean, I knew a very eminent Japanese novelist who told me that. I didn't want to lead with this because it's a little bleak, but she lived through the war, and she said, well, if you compare the kamikaze pilot's experience to the one who was in the human torpedo, these were practices that were just horrible that happened during the war when the military ran out of material. And she said the person who is in the torpedo always has some hope because there's always a chance that you might be saved, right? Whereas the plane, no. And so she preferred that. And so, maybe we always have it. It's something we have as long as we're living, but where do we put it? So where do we, and then maybe it becomes a bit of an emotional investment. So you kind of want to, if you're going to be an optimist or a pessimist, the pessimist is like afraid to invest it because, if it doesn't work out, it's going to hurt, right? It's going to hurt. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but listening to everybody talking about it was kind of thought.
I'm not so sure that hope and optimism are aligned because optimism seems so positive and perhaps expectant, and hope seems to rely on alternatives or consolations. And it's not something that I write about or work on, but I was thinking about Sun Ra at the end of my talk, and also in response to Lamar and this question that I love Sun Ra. To listen to Sun Ra, his music is incredible. I also love that he is so committed. He was so committed to his bit that he is from Saturn. That is his narrative. He never broke character. He said, no, I am from outer space, and did it as a response in part to the plight of being a Black person in America and wanting an alternative, or at least a different narrative to spin out. And yet his music is at times joyful, and sometimes there's a song called Space Loneliness, and there's room for less than optimistic feelings, but it is an alternative, a kind of different space to imagine being in. And that seems to at least offer some kind of consolation or comfort, or at least a difference from feeling trapped.
We're about to continue the conversation at the reception outside, but before we do that, let me remind you that our conversation about hope doesn't end even when the reception ends. It can continue online. Visit us on our homepage, shc.stanford.edu, navigate over to our digital salon called Arcade. Look on the homepage of Arcade, you'll find our colloquy, Hope, the Future of an Idea, which includes contributions from several of these speakers, but also a number of this year's fellows and last year's fellows. And you may comment, you may send items to other people, you may put them on social media, and you may submit your own. So please join us there online, but for the moment, join us outside for a nice reception, and join me now in thanking our 4 speakers.